light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I wanted to offer a few thoughts and reflections on what a friend suggested as the possible fear of women within patriarchy. This was an episode we had actually hoped to record together, but then circumstances didn't allow us to do so. But it seemed a sufficiently important topic that it would be good for me to go ahead and address it anyway, even if I had to do so on my own. Much of human perception seems to be, or much of human history seems to have assumed a polarity within humanity, that there is the male and the female, and that's it. They're simply the two defined categories. Within contemporary times, of course, we're finding out that they're actually, depending on how you measure, I heard one person report that there are actually scientifically, verifiably, as many as 10 different genders. I think in that they were looking at scientific distinctions of chromosomes and genes and so forth, that it's really much more complicated than anything they taught in any high school science class in which I ever sat or which I ever heard even. The basic idea of a patriarchy is a civilizational governmental structure, a societal structure, if you will, even without a formal government, in which the power to decide, the authority to determine how the society will run and what its structure will be, is basically all in the hands of men. In some past civilizations, even some that we otherwise admire, women were considered nothing more than property. And there were numerous times where it would be a cause for great anxiety if women were not content to remain property. If they wanted a voice in government, for example, within the history of the United States even, black people had the vote before women did. Ideally, and by saying that, I'm not wanting to suggest competition between them. I'm simply saying that there were women of every race. And it's interesting to me that we dealt with our racial issues before we dealt with our gender issues, when it would seem that the gender issues have been more obvious for longer, it would seem. In any case, without getting into that tangled discussion, and I hope it didn't offend anyone by what I just said, but the point being, I guess to me, that women have been for as long as there has been a patriarchy in anywhere in the world, women have been the most obvious, everywhere present example of a sort of otherness, that in order for life to continue at all, there had to be women in every single location. And in so many, many locations, in most of the locations within patriarchal humanity's history, women were subjugated. They're paid lower wages. They're given fewer rights. They have men making decisions for them and are not allowed to make their own decisions. In some cases, I suspect people would have argued, actually both men and women probably would have argued for women being less intelligent. In some cases, it was because they were denied education and opportunity. In other cases, it was presumed by certain individuals that they were simply less intelligent because of their gender, that their purpose in life, if you will, was nothing more than reproduction, nothing more than being a sort of baby factory. The problem with that comes up in many of discussions about people is that it's an objectification of the person. A woman is at that point no longer a holistic person, no longer a thinking, breathing, feeling, living, unique individual. The woman is an object. An object to serve a particular purpose, an object with definitions and limitations that have nothing to do with the reality of the individual. The curious thing, this relates to so many different things, the curious thing about coming to terms with women as equal beings in society. Women as sometimes being smarter than men, sometimes being more fair, more loving, more compassionate, more wise than men. The big area of discussion, I guess, that comes to mind is the whole question of those of other orientations. When you start talking about gay men and lesbian women, there was this initially a very generalized perception that the gay men had something of womankind in them that made them different from heterosexual men, and that lesbian women had something of men within them that made them different from heterosexual women. The curious thing in most examples, I think, within human civilization and society was that it was more acceptable because, well, I suppose you could say in some ways they were flying below the radar. For two women to live together for decades, for their whole lives, under this outward premise of simply being two unmarried school teachers or two women who simply didn't have husbands, maybe nobody wanted them or something. Because they were of lesser value, they were pretty much allowed to do whatever they wanted to do. And nobody paid a lot of attention in most situations. On the flip side, however, if a man began to express himself as a gay man, as a homosexual man, and it was perceived as there being something of woman within him, it was as if he was compromising the very foundation of patriarchy, as if he was somehow being less of a man, and in being less, that somehow that needed to be opposed or contained to prevent the weakening of the patriarchy. I suppose in some ways it would have weakened the patriarchy, but it would have invited a greater sense of equality and mutual respect, and in that sense a greater empowerment. Because from the beginning to now, there are still numerous contributions that women make to life that in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, men are simply not able to do on their own. Not overlooking the obvious, of course, of bearing children, but there were sensitivities and aptitudes and concerns and an orientation to life, a nurturing sort of perspective that patriarchy in and of itself has never been able to generate, that administrators in and of themselves have never been able to generate. The administrator, for example, may decide which crop is going to be planted in a particular field, and the administrator may want to decide that this field will produce this much harvest, and to be outraged when it doesn't happen. Whereas the feminine perspective will look at that and say, and listen to it, and look at it, and feel with it in ways that allows the feminine perspective to understand what it needs to be what it is. That you can't go along tugging on the plants to make them get taller. You have to give them food, give them water, give them sunlight, give them clean air, and then they will grow. But it's one of those things that has to be approached indirectly rather than directly. The masculine approach, the patriarchal approach, knows only the direct, demanding, organizational you will, instead of you may, and granting an opportunity and a freedom within which flowers will bloom and plants will flourish. There are many situations in which that metaphor needs to be carried over to people. There are people who will not flourish within a rigid, demanding sort of environment. You will get straight A's, you will earn $60,000 a year, you will accomplish whatever. Some individuals simply cannot relate to that approach to life because there are creative and sensitive and different things within them that require simply a space in which to become who they are, simply a garden in which to bloom. If you try planting, for example, a pumpkin in a flower pot, you're probably going to have a problem because the pumpkin, by its very nature, spreads everywhere. It's a vine. It goes and goes and goes, and it creates enormous fruit that could not possibly fit on the top of a flower pot. It has to be outside the flower pot. It cannot be contained, just by its very nature. In a similar sort of way, there are individuals, and frequently autistic individuals as well, that simply need a nurturing environment in which to blossom and become who and what they are. They simply need an opportunity. Composers and musicians and singers and theatrical designers and actors and actresses who simply need to be given a nurturing space, and the stuff that comes through them and out of them leaves everybody in awe because it's so beautiful and it's so incredible, and wow, where did this come from? And the fact that we can't say for certain where it came from doesn't make it less valuable. In considering all of this in relation to women, patriarchy in essence does have to give something up in order to stop being afraid of women and stop manifesting this fear of women by having restrictions, by having lower wages, by having decreased opportunities, by disallowing public voice as much in certain contexts. Yes, patriarchy will have to give up something in those areas. If patriarchy were to take sufficient time to really study womanhood and really work to understand it, however, I think they would understand that there is so much more to be gained. There is a whole different way of looking at life, a whole different way of experiencing life that will massively empower the whole of society, including all those with patriarchal opinions. They may have patriarchal opinions and only begrudgingly give women opportunities. I suspect they will still find themselves wealthier in the end. That the advances made by women writers and women scientists benefit men just as much, whether they are thankful or not. It reminds me of a television episode I saw once of Xena Warrior Princess, kind of this curious, amusing, and frequently insightful depiction of a woman during, I suppose it would have been like the early Dark Ages or so, pre-industrial times. This woman who was going around helping people in need, being a heroine basically. And in this one particular episode, there was a particular village that was locked in a time loop where it was repeating the same day over and over and over again. And they finally figure out that the reason it's doing that is because this one particular man prayed to the gods to stop time and let them go no further until a particular accident could be prevented such that his loved one would not be killed by this particular accident. And so he prayed to the gods and assumed that the gods would send Hercules, or and he named about 5 or 6 different male heroes that were known to the time of Greek mythology or the early Dark Ages, or the early medieval times. And as he's going down the list of who he thought the gods would send, Xena kind of rolls her eyes and overlooks it and says, yeah, I get it. And which kind of is this wonderfully educational, almost mischievous sort of insertion by the divines as depicted within that episode, that this man looking to patriarchy to save him instead had a woman delivered to him, who did in fact save the day, stopped the accident from happening, and got everything back on track. It was wonderful. Even within Christian sources in the Old Testament, there was a particular battle that was led by a prophetess named Deborah, that apparently God decided this time a woman was going to lead the charge. And it was completely contrary to societal norms and everything, but in the end, it's what the divine chose to do. I suggest that we all consider that there are times within our own life when the divine, however you understand it, may want to intervene in human history and make things better through women, through gay men, through lesbians, through all the anomalous people, all the people who we consider to be the other for no legitimate reason. That through each of these people there may be something wonderful that is trying to make its way into human history that will make things better for everybody. We have to give them a chance. We have to open the door to the possibility. We have to give them the opportunity to speak with their own voice and to regard them as potentially able to contribute things that are every bit as important as anything that can be contributed by any other. going back to our original topics, that the notion of fear of women within patriarchy, what this also integrates, that comes across in so many examples of literature and within movies and television shows all over the place, is the idea of facing your fears, that patriarchy needs to face its fear of women, that patriarchy needs to understand that as long as we don't insist on equal wages for women, as long as we don't insist on equal opportunity, it's as if there is a part of ourselves, or patriarchy, a part of itself, that it is refusing to face, that it is worried about its own devaluation. To which I guess I would respond that the goal is not to reverse roles and have a matriarchy instead of a patriarchy. The goal instead, the desirable goal to me, is to create a society that's integrated and balanced and mutually respectful and holistic, in which neither dominates and neither is submissive, but that it is now about collaboration rather than competition. It is moving beyond thinking in terms of either or, and instead thinking in terms of both and, that we can take all the organization and administration and initiative that patriarchal attitudes are able to produce, and we can integrate it with all of the nurturing, listening, holistic, attentive, environmentally considerate perspectives that the feminine approach is able to bring. And by putting the two together to come up with a holistic perception and definition and experience of life in which it truly is a win-win situation instead of a win-lose situation. Why does someone have to lose in order for someone else to win? I don't think that anyone does have to lose in order for someone else to win. But getting to that point is going to involve all of us individually and collectively changing our thinking and learning to see and to value each other. Stepping for a moment into the metaphor of certain biblical creation narratives, I recall reading a verse somewhere in the past, and I have no idea if it was just a greeting card or who thought this up, but I found its general sentiment very wonderful, very inspiring, very insightful. In the biblical story of creation, Adam is created as this first human being, and Eve becomes the one that is created as a companion for Adam. And the basic biblical story that I was told as a child was that God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and God took a rib from Adam and somehow took this rib from Adam and fashioned it into Eve. Scientifically now that would make us wonder, did that mean that somewhere, if Adam's skeleton is still able to be found, it'll be a skeleton of a man missing one rib? Or does it mean that all men had one more rib than we currently do before that happened, and that it became that way for everyone after Adam as well? It's a trivial side point, I suppose. But what the greeting card brought out is that God chose the rib. God didn't choose a toe so that Adam would stand on top of Eve, and God didn't choose a bone in the head so that Eve would lord it over Adam, and God didn't choose a bone from the hand so that Eve would be nothing more than something Adam used. God chose the rib because it was something from Adam's side so that he would be equal, side by side. God chose the rib because it was something close to the heart, that there was meant to be love between them. God chose the rib because it was something that had to do with the protection of all the most vital parts of being alive. There are a number of metaphorical insights that one can draw from that particular selection, that it was not a random choice. Bridging to a slightly different note, there are certain Christian fundamentalists, I suppose, might be the nicest word for them, that insist, because of their homophobic attitudes, insist that God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And I think they kind of miss the point, because again, they're going back to that assumption, that polarity, that there should be only male and only female, when in fact throughout time, throughout human history, all over the world, there have been all these anomalous examples. People, and a negative perspective would look at them and say, oh, they were just freaks. The inclusive, holistic perspective would look at that and said, they were anomalies, yes. What purpose they served and how they were instructional and educational to the rest of us depends on the specific situation, the specific context. But the point being that when someone is born a hermaphrodite, for example, who has some bits of both genders, or in our current times we have numerous examples of transgender people who find psychologically and emotionally that it's as if they're a woman trapped in a man's body or a man trapped in a woman's body. And that's a very complicated subject about how to respond to that. So I'm going to try not to get into that in this episode, because we've done other episodes on that subject, but like every episode, we never say everything that needs to be said. There's always more to be said. Every discussion is an ongoing discussion, because we're always learning new things. The point that it makes to me to note that there were hermaphrodites, that there were transgender people, that there were all sorts of different combinations, is that it was not so much that Adam and Eve were supposed to be the ends, the bookends, the constraints of everything humanity could be, but rather that within them they carried a zillion little puzzle pieces and building blocks that could be recombined in an infinite number of ways. I've been told that there are no two snowflakes, considering all the snow that falls on the planet in the course of a year. I've been told that there are no two snowflakes that are identical, and that similarly there are no two human beings that are exactly identical in every exact way. I mean, they're not an exact copy. Even clones would have different collections of memories because of having different life experiences. If we cannot replicate any two human beings, then Adam and Eve were the basic building blocks. If the story were interpreted literally, they would be the father and mother of the human race. But every gay or lesbian person had parents who weren't necessarily gay or lesbian. In many cases, gay and lesbians have had children as well, so one could say that it was genetically passed in some sense of the word. But what we learned in basic science classes is that genes can recombine over and over and over, so that all the qualities that great-great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather had aren't necessarily the same qualities on through. Different ones come to the surface, which is why in any individual family you may have people with blonde hair and people with brown hair and people with black hair in the same family. Well, how did it come out three different ways? Well, because within every person, within Adam and Eve, there are an infinite number of possibilities. Within the world of Star Trek, the Vulcan race described this as the miracle, if you will, of, though they probably wouldn't have used the word miracle, infinite diversity in infinite combination. In Adam and Eve, we have the building blocks that can move forward in infinite diversity and in infinite combination. If Adam and Eve had had 5,000 children, Lord knows how many children they did have, but if we looked at it in a literal sense and said they had 1,000 different children, they still would never have two children who were exactly the same. So it's perfectly acceptable to me that orientation was equally variable. That as many different hair colors as you could have as many different forms of gender and orientation. The point in the midst of all that is not to lock it down and say that physical form has to be this way and that's the only ways, but to say that physical form and spiritual form and emotional form and psychological form can have as many different or more possible manifestations as there have ever been people. This much diversity, though, becomes specifically threatening to patriarchy because patriarchy relies upon things that can be controlled, things that can be measured, things that can be organized. In the end, maybe the greatest nightmare to patriarchy is that as much as patriarchy is oriented toward control and definition, patriarchy is the lines. Matriarchy, or the feminine, women, however you want to look at it, would be the spaces, the unknowable, the creative, unlimited, unrestrained, anything's possible. By merging the two, we have limitless possibility in combination with bringing structure and form and limitless power to be directional, to make choices, to be intentional, to live life in an intentional fashion. There's no point in having intentions, though, if you have no new places, no unexplored spaces, no chances at something that's never existed before coming into being. Patriarchy could totally lose its control, could totally lose its domination. And if they would acknowledge it, if they were willing to acknowledge it, patriarchy could be thereby empowered. Why is it that we fear the things that are beyond us that could be most empowering if we just gave them a chance? Simply because they're unknown? If they are unknown, all the more reason to start loving the learning experience and to move into it. I hope the thoughts I've shared in the last half hour have been helpful to you, and I do thank you very much for watching.